Everybody, Casey Hendrickson here. If you don't know who I am, I'm a syndicated radio talk show host in the conservative news talk format. I recently launched a project on my website, theburningtruth.us, where listeners could submit questions to me, asking me about my personal life, my radio career, and the radio industry in general. I get a lot of the same questions over and over again from various members of the audience, and I've helped launch a couple of shows and podcasts as well. And people are always looking for advice or information on the radio industry and how I got into radio and that sort of thing, and kind of curious about how things work. So I decided to go and put this up on my website, and I have a couple of listener questions here. I'm going to start off with Jason. Do you feel that radio is a dying format, and would you ever consider doing a video podcast? Let me address the video podcast thing first, because yes, I have done a video podcast in the past. I actually used to stream to Ustream. The problem is we didn't have it set up to where you could hear the phone calls that were coming in. So you heard me just fine, and you saw me, you just didn't hear the phone calls, and that kind of took something away from it, because sometimes we get very caller intensive on this program. So we're looking at doing it. I've been trying to do it for at least 4 years here. I tried to do it at other radio stations before we came here, but ultimately it comes down to cost and having a sponsor and paying for it and getting it all done, and that's just one of those things that can be difficult to put together. The other question is a very good question. It's also one that we get an awful lot of in radio. Do you feel that radio is a dying format? Right now, some of you already have a preconceived notion. Most of you are not in radio, have never been in radio, and so you're automatically going to say yes or no. But a lot of people outside of radio don't have any idea how healthy radio really is. So the answer is very simply no. Radio is not a dying format. Here's where that comes from. It comes from the radio competitors out there, YouTube, online streaming services, and of course podcasts. And there's nothing wrong with those services because I use them all the time. I've been an advocate for them for many, many, many years. And I was always wanting my radio stations that I worked for to be involved in podcasting and social media and videos and all of that other stuff. And it's been kind of difficult sometimes. My current company that I work for, Federated Media, is very embracive of that technology. CBS Radio wasn't. In fact, you were banned from having social media accounts. You were banned from having podcasts. You were banned from having blogs and that sort of thing because they viewed it as a liability. Of course, it wasn't a liability, and in fact, that has led to some of the best radio growth out there, especially when you consider the listening numbers online with radio, which is something we'll get to here in just a little bit. So radio is not a dying format. That comes from, and it has, we've heard this for many years now, that comes from people who are competitors of radio, and they have a vested interest in trying to kill off radio so they can build their own market share. The problem is that they're lying, they're not telling the truth, and they're doing what they can to gain a competitive advantage. YouTube is out there saying that musicians are not paid as much by radio as YouTube, which of course is ludicrous, but that's a different show altogether. So is radio actually dying? Well, let me go over some numbers for you to go ahead and get this, because podcasts are great. Podcasts are important. Live streaming services are very important as well. But ultimately, they are what they are, and they're niche markets. They're not a broad market. Radio is a much more broad market. And a lot of podcasts, as amazing and awesome as some of the talent in the podcast world is, would not translate into good ratings on a radio station. And so if you have a niche market, which you can draw in from the globe, and you can do very, very well for yourself in the podcasting realm, and that's an amazing thing to do. But it is a entirely different animal than getting into radio, where you have to have more of a broad appeal. So let's look at the top radio formats. Now, this is from 2015. This all comes from Nielsen. Nielsen is the biggest radio ratings company in the world. And so Nielsen's top 15, or 2015 top radio formats, News Talk's number one. News Talk is the most listened to radio format in the United States of America. It used to be News Talk and country would go back and forth with one another, and they kind of fight it out throughout the year. And at the end of the year, one would squeak out over the other, with country winning that a lot of the time. 2014, that changed. 2014, it became News Talk. 2015, it's News Talk. And in fact, we're seeing country drop. News Talk is the number one listened to radio format with 8.9% market share. Now, these are 6+ numbers. Now, what that means is a person who's 6 years of age or older is being factored into this. Now, obviously, talk radio doesn't really care all that much about 6- and 7-year-olds listening to their format, because we're a financially driven format, money-driven format, and 6- and 7-year-olds don't much care about the news or politics, let's be honest. So your ratings even get better when you get into your target demographic, who you're actually trying to get at. So News Talk, the most listened to radio format across the board with 8.9% market share. The number 2 was Top Contemporary Hit Radio, or CHR. They have an 8.2% market share. And then Country at number 3 with a 7.9%, and Country continues to drop. And then you go into Adult Contemporary and then Hot AC and some of the others. Now, this should give you kind of an indication of where the radio listening audience is, but it's not going to give you the full breadth of what exactly radio is. So let me go ahead and go into the Pew Research Center here. Now, the Pew Research Center, again, just a polling firm. They're not tied to radio per se. According to Pew Research Center, traditional AM/FM radio continues to reach the overwhelming majority of the American public audio as a platform. It is stronger than ever as more and more ways to listen continue to emerge. News Talk information stations are one of the most popular broadcast radio formats. In fact, for 2015, my format was the most listened to format in all of radio, and an 11% share of listeners among the 12 and up demographic in 2014. That in 2014, it was second to country music. They also talk about Sirius XM. They saw an increase in revenue. They were up 10%, yada, yada, yada. So in Pew Research outside of radio, okay, this is not a radio industry, just in case people are like, oh, you're in radio and you're not exactly going to give us the best information. I think the fact that I'm employed should probably be a pretty good indicator that radio is doing pretty well. Talk format is a very expensive format to put on. It costs more than the other radio formats. So again, talk radio, number 1 listened to, and radio itself continues to be widely received. Now, here's where we get into the hard facts. Radio is still the leading reach platform out of all media in the United States of America. 93% of Americans listen to AM, FM radio. 93%. Now, that is more than YouTube. That is more than Pandora. Love those services, don't get me wrong. But radio reaches 93% of the American population. Okay, no other format does that, not even television. So 93% of Americans listen to AM, FM radio over the airwaves. It's higher than TV viewership, which is 85%. So 93 versus 85. It is higher than PC use, which is 50%. That's your streaming platforms like Pandora and that sort of thing, YouTube. It's also more than your smartphone, which is 74%. And by the way, we calculate all of that too because we have our mobile apps and everything else. And then tablet use is 29%. So radio over the airwaves, your terrestrial radio, turning on an actual radio and listening to somebody broadcasting in your community, 93% of Americans listen to radio, which is the highest of any other medium. 265 million Americans age 6 and older listen to the radio every single week. 265 million. 66 million millennials use radio each week. Audio consumers are listening for more than 12 hours each week. Now, you'll sit down in front of your television and watch more than 12 hours of television, but more people will turn on the radio than will turn on their television or even go to the computer. Now, when you start factoring this in, obviously, as the audience ages, people have said, well, you know, people who listen to certain formats, they're getting old, they're dying off, and that sort of thing, so things are going to change. There's some truth to that, which is why your format has to be adaptive, and talk radio has, in some markets, done a really good job of adapting. In other markets, they've done a very poor job of adapting. I have always had a young audience in my program, and it is something that traditional talk radio salespeople have struggled with in the past. How do they sell hearing aids and things like that if I've got 25-year-olds walking around listening to my program? But again, I'm younger, I'm the wave of the future, and I'm trying to bring those people in. In fact, you see some of the folks that are really gaining some notoriety, Milo Yiannopoulos over at Breitbart, and some others in the conservative movement, younger guys, younger gals, they're doing things that I have been doing for 11 years, and they have taken it to a whole other level because they've grown up in a media-rich environment. They don't have strings attached to them with corporations and things like that kind of holding them back, and God bless them for doing it. 92% of millennials are reached by radio every single week. 92%, more than any other media platform. And the reason this is important is because millennials are, of course, the wave of the future when it comes to the radio audience. And millennials are, again, listening to radio. Everybody's listening to radio. 92% of millennials are listening to radio. 95% of Generation X are listening to radio every single year. The baby boomers, 94%. So, again, you have a large portion of people that are going to other resources. But when they go to these other resources, when they go into YouTube and they go into Pandora and things like that, they're finding people from radio. So they're listening to radio, and it counts with us. For instance, if I do a podcast of my show every single day, like I do, and I break it down by hours, so hour 1 becomes one podcast, hour 2 is another podcast, and then hour 3 is another podcast, plus I do individual podcasts, they're listening to radio because that's stuff that went out over the air. They just might not have been able to hear my program live or stream it on the computer. So millennials listen to more AM, FM radio than advertisers think. This is according to Westwood One, which is a media company. According to new research published by Westwood One, the advertiser sentiment experts recently polled 305 marketers and agencies on the 18 to 34 radio listening momentum. And what they ended up finding out is that radio listening between 18 and 34, these would be your millennials. Now, this is important, so you got to listen to this. Not only does radio reach more of the American population than any other media outlet at all, including television, not only does it reach, what was the number, 92% of millennials? I think it was, yes, 92% of millennials. But millennials, that 18 to 34 range, millennials are actually listening to more radio than they used to, 11% increase. So not only are you reaching the millennials, not only are most Americans listening to radio, but also the millennials are listening to more radio than they used to. So they started off doing the podcast, the streaming thing, the Pandora thing, but now they're listening to radio. At the end of the day, everything kind of comes back to radio. So Jason, no, radio is not a dying format. Radio was a format that for a while there could not get its act together and figure out how to adapt because there's a lot of, shall we say, the old guard that controls a lot of the big radio companies. They don't control a lot of the small and mid-sized companies, and those small and mid-sized companies have been very adaptive to the new technology. My company, we have audio boom profiles for every radio station that we own, or almost, or we will have. And within those radio stations, you have your individual shows that have their own podcast. You also have individual podcasts themselves that don't air on the radio at all. So radio has started to learn, at least some of the companies have started to learn to embrace social media, streaming services, mobile apps, podcasting, and that sort of thing, which ultimately just brings everybody back into radio. And of course, there's advertising revenue prospects with that stuff as well. So again, radio the most listened to or viewed, the highest reach of any media outlet out there, even higher than television, even higher than computers, higher than mobile phones. All those mobile phones, they are coming on strong. There's no doubt about it. Also tablets. So more people listen to radio. 265 million people listen to radio over the airwaves every single week. And the millennials, that coveted, demographic that is going to be the future of the radio audience. Not only are we reaching 92% of them now, but there's an 11% increase in millennials actually listening to radio. So no, radio is not a dying format. And anybody who says it's a dying format is in one of two categories. Either they are just ignorant, they don't know, or they are in a competitive category and they are hoping that radio will lose market share so they can do better themselves financially, which again, can't really fault them. I'm a capitalist. So Jason, appreciate the question. If you have a question for me about my career, my life, radio in general, or even the talk radio format, you can go to theburningtruth.us and you'll see listener questions right there in the main menu, the navigation menu. Just go and click on that and submit your question right there on the forum, and we'll make a little video just like we did here today. I appreciate it. Thank you very much for watching.